Honorable Henry Cabot Lodge, the Philippine Islands. The Secretary read the bill S-2355 in relation to the suppression of insurrection and to the government of the Philippine Islands ceded by Spain to the United States by the treaty concluded at Paris on the 10th day of December 1898, reported from the Committee on the Philippines as follows. Be it enacted, etc., that when all insurrection against the sovereignty and authority of the United States in the Philippine Islands acquired from Spain by the treaty concluded at Paris on the 10th day of December 1898 shall have been completely suppressed by the military and naval forces of the United States, all military, civil, and judicial powers necessary to govern the said islands shall, until otherwise provided by Congress, be vested in such person and persons, and shall be exercised in such manner as the President of the United States shall direct for maintaining and protecting the inhabitants of said islands in the free enjoyment of their liberty, property, and religion. Mr. Lodge. This bill, Mr. President, is simple but all-sufficient. It makes no declarations and offers no promises as to a future we cannot yet predict. It meets the needs of the present and stops there. The President, under the military power which still controls and must for some time control the islands, could do all that this bill provides. But it is well that he should have the direct authorization of Congress and be enabled to meet any emergency that may arise with the sanction of the lawmaking power until that power shall decree otherwise. Above all, it is important that Congress should assert its authority, that we should not leave the executive acting with the unlimited authority of the war power to go on alone after the conclusion of peace, but that he should proceed under the authority of Congress in whatever he does until Congress shall otherwise and more specifically provide. By this bill, we follow the well-settled American precedents of Jefferson and Monroe, which were used still later in the case of Hawaii. To leave the case of California and New Mexico is to abdicate our own authority. This bill is the assertion of congressional authority and of legislative power of the government. To undertake any further or more far-reaching legislation at this time would be, in my judgment, a great mistake. But I believe it to be of great importance to define our position so that it may be perfectly understood by the inhabitants of the Philippines as well as by our own people. Negotiations, concessions, promises, and hesitations are to the Asiatic mind merely proofs of weakness and tend only to encourage useless outbreaks, crimes, and disorders. A firm attitude, at once just and fearless, impresses such people with a sense of strength and will calm them, give them a feeling of security, and tend strongly to bring about peace and good order. This bill conveys this impression and states the present position of the United States and does nothing more. The operative and essential part of it is in the very words of the act by which Congress authorized Jefferson to govern Louisiana and which received his approbation and signature. It was also used by Congress and by President Monroe in 1819 in regard to Florida. I think that in such a case we may safely tread in the footsteps of the author of the Declaration of Independence. He saw no contradiction between that great instrument and the treaty with Napoleon or the act to govern Louisiana. Some modern commentators take a different view and are unable to reconcile the acquisition of territory without what they call the consent of the governed with the principles of the Declaration. Jefferson found no such difficulty, and I cannot but think that he understood the meaning of the Declaration as well as its latest champions and defenders. At all events, I am content to follow him, content to vote for his bill, content to accept his interpretation of what he himself wrote. Even if he is wrong, those of us who agree with him can console ourselves by thinking that it is perhaps better to err with Pope than shine with pie. The questions involved in the future management of these islands and in our policy in the Far East are of a nature to demand the highest and the most sagacious statesmanship. I have always thought with Webster that party politics should cease at the water's edge. He spoke only in reference to our relations with foreign nations, but I think we might well apply his patriotic principle to our dealings with our own insular possessions, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Philippines should be an American question, not the sport of parties or the subject of party creeds. The responsibility for them rests upon the American people, not upon the Democratic or Republican Party. If we fail in dealing with them, we shall all alike suffer from the failure, and if we succeed, the honor and the profit will redound in the end to the glory and the benefit of all. This view, no doubt, seems visionary, It certainly ought not to be so, and in time I believe it will be accepted. Unfortunately, it is not the case today. One of the great political parties of the country has seen fit to make what is called an issue of the Philippines. They have no alternative policy to propose which does not fall to pieces as soon as it is stated. A large and important part of their membership, North and South, is heartily in favor of expansion because they are Americans and have not only patriotism, but an intelligent perception of their own interests. They are the traditional party of expansion, the party which first went beyond seas and tried to annex Hawaii, which plotted for years to annex Cuba, which have in our past acquisitions of territory their one great and enduring monument. In their new wanderings, they have developed a highly commendable, if somewhat hysterical, tenderness for the rights of men with dark skins dwelling in the islands of the Pacific, in pleasing contrast to the harsh indifference which they have always manifested towards those American citizens who wear the shadowed livery of the burnished sun within the boundaries of the United States. The Democratic Party has for years been the advocate of free trade and increased exports, but now they shudder at our gaining control of the Pacific and developing our commerce with the East. Ready in their opposition to protection, to open our markets to the free competition of all the tropical, all the cheapest labor of the world, they are now filled with horror at the thought of admitting to our markets that small fragment of the world's cheap labor contained in the Philippine Islands, something which neither Republicans nor anyone else think for one moment of doing. Heedless of their past and of their best traditions, careless of their inconsistencies, utterly regardless of the obvious commercial interests of the South, which they control, totally indifferent to the wishes and beliefs of a large portion of their membership and to the advice and example of some of their most patriotic, most loyal, and most courageous leaders to whom all honor is due, the managers of the Democratic organization have decided to oppose the retention of the Philippines and our policy of trade expansion in the East, for which those islands supply the cornerstone. Their reason appears to be the highly sagacious one that it is always wise to oppose whatever Republicans advocate, without regard to the merits of the policy or to the circumstances which gave it birth. I will make no comment upon this theory of political action except to say that it has seemed for a long time exceedingly congenial to the intelligence of the Democratic Party, and that it may perhaps account for the fact that since 1860 they have only held for 8 years a brief and ineffective power. As an American, I regret that our opponents should insist on making a party question of this new and far-reaching problem so fraught with great promise of good both to ourselves and to others. As a party man and as a Republican, I can only rejoice. Once more, our opponents insist that we shall be the only political party devoted to American policies. As the standard of expansion once so strongly held by their great predecessors drops from their nerveless hands, we take it up and invite the American people to march with it. We offer our policy to the American people, to Democrats and to Republicans, as an American policy, alike in duty and honor, in morals and in interest, as one not of skepticism and doubt, but of hope and faith in ourselves and in the future, as becomes a great young nation which has not yet learned to use the art of retreat or to speak with the accents of despair. In 1804, the party which opposed expansion went down in utter wreck before the man who, interpreting aright the instincts, the hopes, and the spirit of the American people, made the Louisiana Purchase. We make the same appeal in behalf of our American policies. We have made the appeal before and won as we deserved to win. We shall not fail now. Before explaining our policy, I should be glad as a preliminary to state the policy proposed by our opponents so that I could contrast our own with it. But I have thus far been unable to discover what their policy is. No doubt it exists. No doubt it is beautiful. But like many beautiful things, it seems to the average searcher after truth both diaphanous and elusive. We have had presented to us, it is true, the policy desired by Aguinaldo and his followers, that we should acknowledge him as a government, enforce his rule upon the other 83 tribes and upon all the other islands, and then protect him from foreign interference. This plan, which would involve us in endless wars with the natives and keep us embroiled with other nations, loads us with responsibility without power and falls into ruin and absurdity the moment it is stated. Another proposition is that we should treat the Philippines as we treat Cuba. That is precisely what we are doing. But what is really meant by this demand is not that we should treat the Philippines as we treat Cuba, but that we should make to them a promise as to the future. And that is what every proposition made by those opposed to the Republican Party comes down to, a promise as to the future. We are to put down insurrection and disorder and hold the islands temporarily without the consent of the governed, but simultaneously we are to make large promises as to the future which will look well in print and keep insurrection and disorder alive. The resolutions offered by senators on the other side and the tenor of their speeches are all of this description. They present no policy, but invite us to make promises. Promises are neither action nor policy, and in the form of legislation are a grave mistake. Those which involve us in pledges of independence have the additional disadvantages of being the one sure means of keeping alive war and disorder in the islands. Those who offer them or urge them proceed on the assumption that you can deal with an Asiatic in the same manner and expect from him the same results as from a European or an American. This shows, it seems to me, a fatal misconception. The Asiatic mind and habit of thought are utterly different from ours. Words or acts which to us would show generosity and kindness and would bring peace and order, to an Asiatic means simply weakness and timidity, and are to him an incentive to riot, resistance, and bloodshed. Promises of this kind, therefore, are neither effective action nor intelligent policy, but the sure breeders of war. If we must abandon the Philippines, let us abandon them frankly. If we mean to turn them over to domestic anarchy or foreign control, let us do it squarely. If we are to retain them, let us deal manfully with the problems as they arise. But do not indulge in the unspeakable cruelty of making promises which our successors may be unable or unwilling to fulfill, and which will serve merely to light the flames of war once more and bring death to hundreds of natives and to scores of American soldiers. Let us not attempt in such a situation and with such responsibilities to mortgage an unknown future and give bonds to fate which will be redeemed in blood. The policy we offer, on the other hand, is simple and straightforward. We believe in the frank acceptance of existing facts and in dealing with them as they are and not on a theory of what they might or ought to be. We accept the fact that the Philippine Islands are ours today and that we are responsible for them before the world. The next fact is that there is a war in those islands which, with its chief in hiding and no semblance of a government, has now degenerated into mere guerrilla fighting and brigandage with a precarious existence predicated on the November elections. Our immediate duty, therefore, is to suppress this disorder, put an end to fighting, and restore peace and order. That is what we are doing. That is all we are called upon to do in order to meet the demands of the living present. Beyond this, we ought not to go by a legislative act, except to make such provision that there may be no delay in reestablishing civil government when the war ends. The question of our constitutional right and power to govern those islands in any way we please I shall not discuss. Not only is it still in the future, but if authority is lacking, the Constitution can be amended. Personally, I have no doubt that our Constitution gives full right and authority to govern the Philippines without making them either economically or politically part of our system, neither of which they should ever be. When our great Chief Justice John Marshall, Clarem et venerabile nomen, declared in the Cherokee case that the United States could have under its control, exercised by treaty or the laws of Congress, a domestic and dependent nation, I think he solved the question of our constitutional relations to the Philippines. Further than the acts and the policy which I have just stated, I can only give my own opinion and belief as to the future. And as to the course to be pursued in the Philippines, I hope and believe that we shall retain the islands and that peace and order once restored, we shall and should reestablish civil government beginning with the towns and villages, where the inhabitants are able to manage their own affairs. We should give them honest administration and prompt and efficient courts. We should see to it that there is entire protection to persons and property in order to encourage the development of the islands by the assurance of safety to investors of capital. All men should be protected in the free exercise of their religion, and the doors thrown open to missionaries of all Christian sects. The land which belongs to the people and of which they have been robbed in the past should be returned to them and their titles made secure. We should inaugurate and carry forward, in the most earnest and liberal way, a comprehensive system of popular education. Finally, while we bring prosperity to the islands by developing their resources, we should, as rapidly as conditions will permit, bestow upon them self-government and home rule. Such, in outline, is the policy which I believe can be and will be pursued toward the Philippines. It will require time, patience, honesty, and ability for its completion, but it is thoroughly practicable and reasonable. The foundation of it all is the retention of the islands by the United States, and it is to that question that I desire to address myself. I shall not argue our title to the islands by the law of nations, for it is perfect. No other nation has ever questioned it. It is too plain a proposition to warrant the waste of time and words upon it. Equally plain is our right under the Constitution by a treaty which is the supreme law of the land to hold those islands. I will not argue this point, nor the entire legality of all that the President has done in accordance with his constitutional power and with the law passed by Congress at the last session, which recognized the necessity of an increased army in order to cope with the existing insurrection. The opposition to the Republican policy rests its weight on grounds widely different from these. They assert that on moral grounds we have no right to take or retain the Philippines, and that as a matter of expediency our whole Eastern policy is a costly mistake. I traverse both assertions. I deny both propositions. I believe we are in the Philippines as righteously as we are there rightfully and legally. I believe that to abandon the islands or to leave them now would be a wrong to humanity, a dereliction of duty, a base betrayal to the Filipinos who have supported us, led by the best men of Luzon, and in the highest degree contrary to sound morals. As to expediency, the arguments in favor of the retention of the Philippines seem to me so overwhelming that I should regard their loss as a calamity to our trade and commerce and to all our business interests, so great that no man can measure it.